Hey everyone, welcome to Great Lakes Church. My name is Carson, and I gotta tell you before we get into our weekly message that we're a community of people helping people find and follow Jesus. We're based out of Southeast Wisconsin. We have physical locations in Kenosha and Racine, but if you're listening to this or watching this, you've found our online presence. We share content on our YouTube and our podcast platforms wherever you listen, and we love that you're a part. If you want to know more about what's going on here at Great Lakes Church, you can find out more at greatlakeschurch.com or check out our central hub. But until then, everything you need is going to be in the description, so enjoy the message, and we'll catch you next time.
Hello. In the 1980s, one of the most popular options for children and teenagers who were bored and wanted a little bit of excitement was to go to an indoor mall and start walking around. I mean, that was the extent of our lives, right? And obviously in the past decade and even a little bit longer, malls are turning into museums, right? But when I was growing up, they were centers of entertainment. I mean, in the 1980s, almost every mall in America had an arcade. So you'd walk into the arcade and there were certain games that just had everyone swarmed around them. Now people have arcades in their house, right? But when I was growing up, it was like you'd get to these places and you would play games like Pac-Man, right? Asteroid, Centipede, Frogger, Dig Dug, Pole Position, Q-Bert, right? But if those games were taken, there were other lame games that you could go and there wasn't that big of a line. One of those games was called Whack-A-Mole, right? Very simple game. Almost childish. These small plastic moles, they would just start popping up at an increasing rate of speed. And so they'd start out initially really slow, but then they'd get a little bit faster. Sometimes they'd pop up at the same time. And the mission was to take a mallet and to strike these moles down. And if you missed them, right, if you, for whatever reason, didn't hit them hard enough, you wouldn't score. So you'd put in a quarter, and for the next 60 seconds, you just take out your aggression, trying to get all of these different moles. So today we are launching this brand new teaching series called Whack-A-Mole. And over the next several weeks, what we're gonna do is we're gonna talk about the destructive issues that just seem to pop up over and over and over in our lives, and what we can do to strike them down. Now, what's interesting is that many of the destructive issues that surface in our lives are not things that we would have even thought about or predicted when we were in our adolescent years. And the reason why is when we were in our childhood, right? We were children, we were teenagers. In those years of our life, we were really idealistic. This is why when you look at our yearbooks, regardless of whether it was middle school or high school or whatever stage of life we're in, the yearbooks have like inspirational quotes, right? Motivational phrases that just kind of seem to capture our heart and optimism. And so we would write it in, or sometimes it'd be printed in ink, things like follow your dreams, or you can't move forward without saying goodbye to the past, right? Be yourself because everyone else is taken. And futures don't make themselves, you have to create them. If you believe you can, then you're already halfway there. And so yearbooks, of course, are packed with these kind of quotes. And one of the trends that has kind of unfolded in high schools around the country is that if you're a senior, not only is your picture larger than the other pictures in the yearbook, but now a lot of yearbooks have quotes that get attached to the senior. And sometimes they're really motivational and really thoughtful. And other times, I mean, this is what you deal with seniors in high school. They're just, they go off the rails. So here's a few that went off the rails. Randy Chung, he said, high school was easy. It was like riding a bike, except the bike was on fire and the ground was on fire and everything was on fire because it was hell, right? Sophia, she quotes her mom, I'm surprised you graduated, mom. Daniel, he quotes his dad, why you no doctor yet? I love that. Jaira, here's what Jaira says. He says, if you like water, you already like 72% of me. There's an optimist, right? Ethan, he has a brilliant quote. He says, if idiots could fly, this place would be an airport. How about Garrett? He says, I get butterflies when I think of myself. There's a guy who does not lack confidence. And then Jatavius, he says, they say cheaters never win, but I just graduated. Boom. Right? And when you're a senior in high school or you're in your young adult years, you just have this like lighthearted approach to life. In fact, I've shown this picture before. when I was in college, this was the picture I had in my photo directory for college. And that's not a joke, right? I said I was from Yokohama, Japan, and I was just goofy. Why? Because you can do that in those years of your life. Here's what I can tell you. When you're in middle school, when you're in high school, when you're writing in somebody's notebook or you're thinking about the future, nobody is ever expressing phrases like, well, what I want for my life is I want to become jaded and distrustful of humanity by the time I'm 40. Right? Nobody puts that. When you're in middle school, you're in high school, you're in your young adult years, you're not saying, I've got this big dream to grow so distrustful and so pessimistic of the people around me that it damages my family. It makes it impossible for people to work with me or get along with me. Go Packers, right? Generally speaking, we're young, we're hopeful, we're idealistic, we're excited about the future. But what happens is as we transition from adolescence into adulthood, cynicism starts to pop up in various areas of our life. Cynicism begins to just surface, and it reveals itself in things like negativity or lack of trust or sarcasm or hopelessness or just this overall critical attitude towards life. And it's easy to blame social media, right? It's easy to blame TV and movies, but come on, this has been a part of humanity since the beginning of time. In fact, in the scriptures, we read about a guy named Philip who lived in the first century, and he tells his friend Nathaniel about Jesus. So he had an encounter with Jesus. He goes and he tells his friend Nathaniel, he says, Nathaniel, I want you to meet Jesus. He says, I'm telling you, he's the Messiah. He is the chosen one from God. He's the king that Israel has been waiting on for hundreds of years. I found him. He's from the town of Nazareth. I want you to meet him, Nathaniel. And here's the response we come across. Nazareth, explained Nathaniel. Can anything good come from Nazareth? His response isn't, wow, I can't wait to meet him. It's not, man, you found the Messiah we've been waiting on hundreds of years. This is exciting. He says, from Nazareth? How can that be? A Democrat? Can anyone be a smart Democrat? A conservative? Can anyone really say that they're loving and still be a conservative? Every single human being that's ever lived has had to fight cynicism. And it's very interesting when you think about it because nobody ever sets out to become cynical. Cynicism is just something that just slowly starts overtaking us. Different moles just start popping up in our life that over time, if we don't learn to strike them down, will cause us to become skeptical and suspicious of others. So you borrow money to someone you consider a friend and then they don't pay you back, right? You fall in love with someone and you think, man, this is the one. You think you are on the path to marriage and then they break your heart into a million pieces. They just become another picture to burn, right? You become friends with a coworker who is kind and caring and then they get promoted. And just over time, you watch them become corrupted by power and greed and money just like everybody else. Or you commit yourself to serving people and loving people and protecting people and caring for people, but then you find yourself being taken advantage of over and over and over again. And life just has this way of chipping away at us until we're hurt or we're disillusioned. So nobody sets out to become cynical. It's not a dream of ours. It just kind of happens. And if we don't learn how to strike down the various things that produce that kind of cynicism in our life, we're going to just find ourselves on the losing end of life. So let me just tell you where I battled this, right? From a very young age, I knew that I wanted to be a pastor. I'm talking middle school, high school. I knew that, hey, this is what I want to do with my life. So here's a picture of me at 16 years old. I mean, I'm ready. I want to be a pastor. And so all my buddies are playing video games. They're dreaming about being, a police officer or becoming a doctor or becoming a school teacher. And I just knew. So I know it's odd to some of you, but I'm going to be a pastor. The very first message I ever gave was to the youth group I was a part of at 13 years old. Now, I don't have video of that, but I do have a little bit of video of when I was 16 years old giving a message to them. And it's just very brief, but I'll give you a little glimpse of what this was like.
Because of sin. We have been separated by compromise. We've been separated because of complacency. We've been separated because even of tradition and religion. We've been separated.
All right, I don't know why I wear a sweatshirt about 5 times too big for me. But here I am, and I'm speaking to my youth group, and I'm passionate, and I just know this is what I want to do with my life. And so I started interning with the church that I grew up at, and then I went to college to prepare to be a pastor, and then I started traveling with a friend of mine and started speaking at churches in different parts of the country. And eventually, it happened. The day arrived. I was in my early 20s, and I became a pastor. And I had this picture in my mind. I'm going to spend my days studying the scriptures and teaching them. I'm going to be praying with people. I'm going to be praying for people. I'm going to be showing up at difficult seasons of people's lives. I'm going to get to be a friend to people who need a friend. What I didn't know in my early 20s is I was going to have a front row seat to the messiness of life. That I would watch several of my friends who loved Jesus deeply over the years slowly deconstruct their faith. That I would have a front row seat to watch people who had a tremendous impact on my faith journey slowly drift away from God. Like, I've seen so many things over there. I see people who, man, they talked about how God did a great miracle in their life, healed them of this disease, and then 3, 5, 7 months later, they have the same disease. And it's just messy. And it's just been hard for me to connect the dots, right? I've watched pastor buddies of mine lose their jobs because of affairs or addictions. Great Lakes Church is not exempt, right? I've had close friends at this church walk away because of something I taught that they just didn't agree with. I've had people leave because they said I hurt them by something I did. It wasn't intentional, but it happened. I've been hurt by things other people have done. And I'm telling you, as I look back on the past 3 decades of being a pastor, there are plenty of times I can point to where I was in a season of being disillusioned. I was not trusting people, and I was just critical of the world around me. And in those seasons, I always start to think the same thing, right? I start to think, well, I'm just pouring out my heart and nobody cares. It feels like all of this is a waste of time because people say they want to change it and they do for a little bit, but then eventually they go back and nobody is really changing. When it comes to prayer, it just doesn't seem like there's really a point in praying. God's just going to do what God's going to do. He never really even answers any of my prayers. I've had people who have talked about me, and so I get to the point where I'm like, well, I'm not going to trust anybody. I'm going to hang with these 2 or 3 people, and this is who I'm hanging with. I've never left anyone in 15 years of being a pastor. I've showed up at some of the most difficult times in people's life, but I've had plenty of people who've walked away and abandoned me. Now, I'm not asking you to feel sorry for me because I know I'm not a victim because you all have your stories, right? You have stories of you start out optimistic in a career or optimistic in a marriage or optimistic as a parent. And then over time, you just found yourself becoming jaded and cynical. And what cynicism does is it causes us to lose perspective and it causes us to just generalize everything, right? So when it comes to politics, well, every politician is corrupt and the whole system is rigged. When it comes to churches, all churches really want is your money. When it comes to romantic relationships, there's no such thing as true love. It's all an illusion. You're always going to get your heart hurt. When it comes to corporations, every one of them is driven by greed and profit. Right? Even things like serving and giving and charity. When we become cynical, we just generalize everything, right? Every single bit of it is ultimately rooted in selfishness because people only do things that are nice because they want to feel good about themselves or they want to look good to others. When we are cynical, we generalize everything. In our Bible, there is a biography of a guy by the name of Job. Great man, loved God, lived a very honorable life. But when Job went through a long season of intense pain and intense loss, he eventually comes to this conclusion. He says, I will never again feel happiness. Never. There's not going to be a minute, there's not going to be an hour, there's not going to be a day of relief. I will never again feel happiness. That's how he felt. So how do you go from being hopeful, how do you go from being idealistic and excited about the future to just being overcome with cynicism and a distrust for others? There's no easy answer, but one of the reasons that we become cynical in life is because, quite honestly, we know too much. Right? Do you ever wonder why most of us were so happy when we were kids? It's because we were dumb. Guys, we were naive, right? We hadn't experienced all that much in life. I mean, just think of how innocent we were. We thought if you drink if you eat Pop Rocks and you drink soda, your stomach's going to explode. I mean, that was like the intensity of our thinking, right? If you swallow gum, you won't digest it for 7 years. Or if you go swimming right after you eat, you're gonna drown, you're gonna cramp. I mean, that was the biggest fear we had to live with. Wouldn't you do anything to get back to that being the biggest stress of your life? When we were kids, we thought all adults were mature, right? That they knew how to manage their emotions because they were constantly teaching us. We assumed teachers knew everything. We just had this perspective of life that was so innocent. When we were 10 years old, most of us did not know that someone could break our heart in the way it can be broken. We were 10 years old. We didn't realize that if you do a good job at something, you can still get fired. That if you push everything in and pursuing your dreams, it's still possible to not achieve them. That it's possible to be kind to someone and they're still gonna be mean in return. And so what happens is the older we get, the more we know about life because we've experienced more of it. 3,000 years ago, King Solomon of Israel, he writes a book called Ecclesiastes. He shares some of the observations he makes. And in the book, Solomon talks in the first person. He writes in the first person, he calls himself teacher. And here's what he says: everything is meaningless, says the teacher. Completely meaningless. Solomon says, I've explored everything, I've learned everything, I've seen everything, I've done almost everything, and my conclusion is that all of this is meaningless. And then he asks a question. He says, what do people get for all their hard work under the sun? In other words, yeah, you're gonna get a paycheck, but what do you do with the paycheck? You go buy stuff? And then what do? After a while, you trade it in or you upgrade it? And then someday you're gonna die. What happens then? You're gonna have the people who love you most take all of your stuff and put it in a front yard and market for $1. And then someone's gonna come along and say, that's too much. Will you take a quarter for that? That's what's gonna happen. And Solomon says, man, it just feels very meaningless. He continues. He says, generations come and generations go, but the earth never changes. If you died today, the world's gonna go on. If you died today, guess what? The place you work, it's gonna still exist tomorrow. Your home's still gonna be standing there. Your life, my life, we're just a dot on the timeline of this world. Solomon continues. He says, the sun rises and the sun sets, then hurries around to rise again. The wind blows south and then it turns north. Around and around it goes, blowing in circles. I mean, this book of Ecclesiastes that Solomon writes, it is a cynic's guide to the universe. He just has this perspective that's so jaded. And he wraps up his thoughts in his opening chapter with these words. He says, the greater my wisdom, the greater my grief. To increase knowledge only increases sorrow. The more I know, the more cynical I become. Life has a way of chipping away at our optimism. And as we move from optimism into cynicism, what happens is we start losing hope. And we see this by the way we tend to project the past onto the future. And that's what cynics do, right? They project the past onto the future. So you fall in love with someone and the relationship falls apart. And then it happens again. Maybe even happens a third time. And now your idea of relationships is eventually all relationships are doomed to fail. Or maybe you poured yourself into a career and then you lost your job, or someone else got promoted and they didn't deserve it and you knew you worked harder. And eventually you do that enough times and you say, why even try? Why even bother? I see the pattern here. And so we project the past onto the future. And what happens is the hurt of our past is pronouncing a death sentence on any potential that's ahead of us. And the reason why is because our hearts do not have compartments, right? When we become hurt, when we become jaded, when we become distrustful, regardless of the reason why, it spills over into almost all the areas of our life. Unknowingly, we just carry it with us everywhere we go. Yes, it was that person who hurt me, but I now carry that hurt into other relationships. It was that situation that caused me to become jaded, but now I'm carrying that jaded attitude everywhere I go. And over time, it just slowly, it's not overnight, but we stop hoping, we stop believing, we stop trusting, and we just end up concluding this is as good as it gets. And then to complicate the problem, cynics are naturally drawn to each other. Right? We do not attract what we want in life. We attract who we are. So we're like magnets. Negative people just naturally find negative people. Positive people, they don't want to spend a bunch of time with negative people. People who are chronically negative, right? Because they have a different attitude of life. And so once cynicism has made its way into our hearts, it's hard to defeat it because we're surrounded by people who are thinking like us. I love what King Solomon's father David writes in Psalm chapter 1 and out of the Voice translation. He says, God's blessings follow you and await you at every turn. When you don't follow the advice of those who delight in the wicked schemes, when you avoid sin's highway, when judgment and sarcasm beckon you, but you refuse. Now, let's just be realistic, right? There is no doubt that people in this life will occasionally take advantage of us and betray our trust in some way. But what we have to do is learn how to identify when those moments are coming and actively strike them down so that we don't become cynical. Because once we become cynical, it seems like almost everything in life becomes a conspiracy theory. We're always suspicious of other people. We're convinced that everybody has an ulterior motive. We question everybody's motive. It makes us think that everyone wants to use us or take advantage of us in some way. And what cynicism does is it focuses on the worst in people, not the best. And it takes away our joy. And it pushes us away from others rather than draws us to them. Eventually, cynicism leads to despair. That's the bad news. The good news is, whether you want to believe this or not, cynicism is a choice. Life does not make you cynical. You make you cynical. I say that because there's plenty of people who've been through what you've been through, experienced what you've experienced, and they just have a different attitude. I get to decide, at the end of the day, I get to decide whether or not I close my heart to others. And I get to decide whether or not I stop engaging and stop trusting and stop believing and stop hoping. That is my decision. And sometimes we forget this. But for those of us who are followers of Jesus, everything in our faith is pointing to a hopeful future. Everything about what we believe is pointing to a hopeful future. 2,600 years ago, a large percentage of the Jewish population were living in exile. It's a crazy difficult time for the nation of Israel. And during that time, the Jewish prophet Jeremiah speaks these words to the Jewish people on behalf of God. For I know the plans that I have for you, says the Lord. They are plans for good and not for disaster, to give you a future and a hope. Everything about our faith points to a hopeful future. In the first century, many of the Jews who chose to follow Jesus faced intense persecution because of their faith. And the author of Hebrews writes a letter to them and encourages them with these words. Let us hold tightly without wavering to the hope we affirm, for God can be trusted to keep his promises. Everything about our faith points to a hopeful future. To followers of Jesus living in Rome in the first century, very difficult place to follow Jesus. The Apostle Paul writes these words, I pray that God, the source of hope, will fill you completely with joy and peace because you trust in him. Everything about our faith points to a hopeful future. So when everybody else sees death, we see life. When everybody else sees the ending, we see a beginning. When everybody else sees destruction, we see the possibility for building something new. And so I just want you to know this. If you have a cynical approach to life, you are standing in opposition to the message of Jesus. Because the message of Jesus is that things can change and things can get better. And there is hope and there is a future. I love this quote by Steve Poe. He says, cynics never change the world. They tell us why the world can't change. And so as followers of Jesus, we have a responsibility to do whatever we can to fight the cynicism, to work against it so it does not make its way into our heart. And there are things that we need to be doing to actively strike it down. So you see negativity come out, you can strike it down. You see distrust coming, you can strike it down. Right? You feeling a little bit jaded, you can strike it down. So let's talk about some of those things. Number one, we confess it. We acknowledge it. We see it. It's made its way in our heart. And we say, okay, it's there. James, who's the brother of Jesus, he writes these words. He says, confess your sins to each other and pray for each other so that you may be healed. A lot of times healing occurs when we are able to identify and acknowledge this has made its way into my heart. I don't want it there anymore. And so I confess it. I acknowledge it's there. Another thing that you and I can do to strike down the cynicism in our life is learn to be curious. Right? Instead of having answers all the time, we need to learn to ask questions. We need to be open to learning about people and learning about life rather than just having all of these opinions all the time. So a few years ago, I read a book called Factfulness, and it focuses on how even though many people in our world think that it's getting worse day by day in this crazy and evil world, the reality is, in most ways, in many ways at least, our world is improving and getting better. But cynicism blinds us to that reality, right? So it's easy to have a very bleak worldview because of things that we've seen or things that we've heard or things that we've assumed. But the reality is things are not as bleak as we make them out to be. In fact, I'm going to read something from the book. It's a little lengthy, so you're going to have to stay with me. But I love how the author just kind of talks about this. He says, think about the world: war, violence, natural disasters, man-made disasters, corruption. Things are bad, and it feels like they are getting worse, right? The rich are getting richer, and the poor are getting poorer. And the number of the poor just keeps increasing. And we will soon run out of resources unless we do something drastic. At least that's the picture that most Westerners see in the media and carry around in their heads. I call it the overdramatic worldview. It's stressful and it's misleading. In fact, the vast majority of the world's population lives somewhere in the middle of the income scale. Perhaps they're not what we think of as middle class, but they are not living in extreme poverty. Their girls go to school, their children get vaccinated, they live in 2-child families, and they want to go abroad on holiday, not as refugees. Step by step, year by year, the world is improving. Not on every single measure, every single year, but as a rule. Though the world faces huge challenges, we have made tremendous progress. This is the fact-based worldview. And the book focuses on encouraging data, like how over the last 20 years, the amount of people living in extreme poverty has been cut in half. And how 80% of our world now has access to electricity. And generally speaking, the world has never been as safe as it is today. It's way less violent than it's been historically. But individuals who are cynical will never believe that because they're not curious. Cynical people don't want to know the facts. They don't want to hear anybody's story because they already know how everything ends and it's not good. Every year that you and I get older, we have to fight cynicism. Why? Because cynicism is rooted in knowledge. And every year that goes by, we know a little bit more. We've experienced a little bit more. We've seen a little bit more. And so we have to train ourselves to be curious. We have to learn to ask questions. We have to be open to new friendships. We have to push ourselves to reading books and listening to podcasts and expanding our thinking. Something else that we can do to strike down cynicism is just choose to focus on the good. Now, it just seems like it wouldn't be that difficult, right, to do, but come on, this is kind of requires some sort of meditation, requires us to just slow down and focus our thoughts. Because naturally, we're being bombarded with all the negativity. 2,000 years ago, the Apostle Paul's sitting in a prison cell and he writes these words: fix your thoughts on what is true and honorable and right and pure and lovely and admirable. Think about things that are excellent and worthy of praise. With all of the negativity that surrounds us, we have to be intentional to feed our mind on good things. Right? So just think about the difference between a vulture and a hummingbird. Vultures, they soar high in the sky, looking and searching. And what do they find? Dead things, right? This ugly, oversized bird doesn't stop until it finds lifeless, rotting roadkill. Now take the vulture and contrast that with the hummingbird. What do they find? Not dead, rotting things, but sweet, life-giving nectar. And every single day, each bird finds what it's looking for. The same is true for you, and it's true for me. We will find what we search for. If we want to find things to be negative about and worried about and concerned about, we'll find it. And if we want to find things to be positive about, that can happen too. Last week, my wife and I, we flew to San Diego to meet up with some other pastors for a week of hanging out and learning. It's something we do on an annual basis. And it was a crazy start to the trip. All right, we get down to O'Hare. Our flight is delayed 5 times. And eventually, after many, many hours, it is canceled. So then we have to wait 60 minutes in a line to get vouchers for a hotel and for food. We get our vouchers, we go to eat. All the restaurants at O'Hare are closed except for one, McDonald's. So we're standing in line, and the person working yells loud enough for everyone to hear, hey, all we're making right now is fries. If you don't want fries, you might as well leave because we don't have anything else we're making. You can imagine my emotions are starting to turn. Then I go outside to stand for a shuttle. It is 40 minutes to wait for the shuttle. Eventually it shows up, and it is a van. It has seats for 12 people, but we have 15 who have to make their way in. We became a close family. We get to the hotel. Guess what? 30-minute line at the hotel to get a room because all of these people are trying to get in. Eventually, we get to the front of the line. We talk about how next day we need to get the shuttle. What time does the shuttle leave? They said the free shuttle is already booked. If you want a shuttle, you're going to have to pay for one. The emotions are going. But while we're standing there, somebody comes through with some pizza and says, is anybody hungry? Because I've eaten most of my pizza. But does anybody actually want to take the rest of my pizza even though you don't know me? I said, you are a prophet from the living God. I will take those 3 slices of pizza. Ladies and gentlemen, I did get some pizza. A little glimmer of hope in the midst of all that. The next morning, Randy and I, we get up, we see our flight is delayed again. Ended up being delayed a couple more times. Eventually, we were able to change our flight from landing in San Diego to landing at John Wayne Airport in Orange County. They said, do not worry about the luggage, it will follow you. I have air tags in my luggage. I get on the plane, and before we even take off, I said, Randy, one of our pieces of luggage has already made it to San Diego. It was over and over and over. So I tried to deal with it through customer service by buying Wi-Fi on the airplane. Don't worry, it was only $30 for Wi-Fi. I'm in the middle of talking with them. It took me forever to get a hold of them. And the customer service says, sir, you have reached the customer service for Wi-Fi support, not for luggage support. And all I could think of is how much I hate traveling. But I had to focus my mind and my heart because I was going to San Diego to hang out with my closest friends in the world. And I said, this is not that big of a deal. We're not living in the 1700s. We can do this. It's a day of inconvenience. And the challenge of doing that is not that big of a deal one day. But you know this. We have to do this day after day after day after day. Refocus our minds, refocus our hearts, refocus our mind, refocus our hearts. But we can do it. And we do it by expressing gratitude. We do it by writing thank you notes. We do it by learning to speak life-giving words to people because every time we do that, it builds inside of us a positive attitude and a better outlook. Now, sometimes we're in such a low season that it feels impossible to get to a place where we're focusing on the good. It just feels like there's so much bad happening. In those seasons, this is why we need positive, life-giving people as friends. Because our friends come alongside us and they help us see what we cannot see. In this season of the church, I've had several of my pastor friends reach out to me on a weekly basis who say, Dave, we're praying for you. We know Great Lakes Church has a bright season ahead. We know this right now. You're trying to deal with staffing and trying to figure out the next season of the church. But man, I'm surrounded by people pointing me to a better future. We've got to learn to strike down cynicism. Something else we can do to strike down cynicism is find ways to renew. Because almost nothing fuels cynicism like burnout. When we're emotionally or physically or mentally exhausted, it is almost impossible to see the good. There's a Jewish prophet by the name of Elijah who's burned out. He got to the point he couldn't see good in anything. Matter of fact, after witnessing one of the most powerful miracles of all time, he learns that there are some people who want him dead, and so he goes on the run. And eventually he stops running. He's tired, he sits down, and here's what we read. I have had enough, Lord, he said. Take my life, for I am no better than my ancestors who have already died. He went from seeing an incredible miracle to now he's just like, take my life, I'm done. That's what burnout will do. And eventually he eats some food and he drinks some water and he sleeps for a while and he wakes up and he has enough strength for the journey ahead. But burnout will make you cynical. And so one of the greatest things you can do to strike down cynicism and find ways to renew yourself. One more thing you can do to strike down cynicism is be intentional about doing something for other people. See, it's easy to spend our life watching the news, scrolling through social media, building a worldview that's just depressing, and this whole thing's just all gonna end. But when we serve other people, it does something in our hearts. When we write thank you notes, it does something in our hearts. When we join a project on a Saturday morning for one of our Saturday serves, or we serve at our schools for our children, or we serve in one of the programs at the church, it just does something inside of us. Every single day we are being bombarded with people or situations that just keep popping up, and man, they're causing us to grow skeptical or suspicious or distrustful of others. But I want you to know that is not the life God has for you. When Jesus was talking about his followers and the life he has for them, here's what he said. He said, the thief's purpose is to steal and kill and destroy. He says, my purpose is to give them a rich and satisfying life. Cynicism robs us of the life Jesus has for us. It robs us of happiness and trust and dreams and hope. And so when burnout starts to pop up, we have to find ways to strike it down. When entitlement pops up, we have to find ways to strike it down. When negativity pops up, we have to find ways to strike it down. And we do that by choosing to be curious, and by focusing on the good, and by finding ways to renew, and by learning to do things for other people. Like, you and I get to control this. You and I get to make the choice. We confess it. We say, I'm not gonna let this have a foothold in my life. Let me pray. Our Heavenly Father, we thank you for all the good you do for us, the blessings in our life, the fact that you've given us life. Lord, we thank you for the families you've given us, for the possessions you've given us, for a place to sleep, for the cars we have to drive around. Like, Lord, we genuinely want to express gratitude. And we ask that you would help us to guard against the cynicism that can creep into our lives. As your followers, we want to be voices of hope and voices of encouragement. And we want to see the good and not the bad. We want to be people who, when others see death, we see life. When others see the end, we see the beginning. Help us. In Jesus' name, amen.
Thanks for joining us here at Great Lakes Church. Again, my name is Carson, and I'm so glad that you chose to share some time with us this week. We hope something in this talk was meaningful to you, encouraging to you, and maybe even something worth writing down that you can go share with a friend. If you'd like to get involved, maybe join us at one of our physical locations in Southeast Wisconsin, or just be a part of our many other goings-on our social platforms or events in the area. Check out greatlakeschurch.com.